Hello, my name is Teresita Blanco, the Artsy sister, and we're reading Stefan Zweig, a story called Amok. In March 1912, a strange accident occurred in Naples Harbor during the unloading of a large ocean-going liner, which was reported at length by the newspaper, although in extremely fanciful terms. Although I was a passenger on the Oceania, I did not myself witness this strange incident, nor did any of the others, since it happened while coal was being taken on board and the cargo unloaded, and to escape the noise we all had to go ashore to pass the time in the coffee houses or the theaters. And it is my personal opinion, however, that a number of conjectures, which I did not voice publicly at the time, provide the true explanation of that sensational event, and I think that, at a distance of some years, I may now be permitted to give an account of the conversation I had in confidence immediately before the curious episode. When I went to the Calcutta shipping agency trying to book a passage on the Oceania for my voyage home to Europe, the clerk apologetically shrugged his shoulders. He didn't know if it would be possible for him to get me a cabin. He said at this time of the year, with the rainy season imminent, the ship was likely to be fully booked all the way from Australia, and he would have to wait for a telegram from Singapore. And next day I was glad to hear he told me that yes, he could still reserve me a cabin, although not a particularly comfortable one, and it would be below the deck amidst the amidships. And as I was impatient to get home, I did not hesitate for long, but took it. And it's gonna be like the worst room possibly imagined. The clerk had not misinformed me. The ship was overcrowded and my cabin a poor one, a cramped little rectangle of a place near the engine room, lit only by a dimly through circular porthole, and the thick curled air smelled greasy and musty, and I do not know for a moment escaped the electric ventilator fan that hummed as if circling overhead like a steel bat gone mad. Misery squeak. Down below, the engines clatter and groan like a breathless coal heaver, constantly climbing the same flight of stairs. Up above, I heard the tramp of footsteps pacing the promenade deck the whole time, and as soon as I had stowed my luggage away amidst the dingy girders in my stuffy tomb, I went back on deck to get away from the blaze, and as I came out to the deck below, I drank in the soft, sweet wind blowing off the land as if it were ambrosia. But the atmosphere of the promenade deck was crowded and restless too, full of people chattering incessantly, hurrying up and down with the uneasy nervousness of those forced to be inactive in a confined space. The arch flirtatious of the woman, the constant pacing up and down of the bottleneck of the deck as a flock of passengers surpasses deck chairs, always meeting the same faces again, and were actually painful to me. And I had seen the new world. I had taken in the turbulent, confusing images that raced wildly to my mind, and now I wanted the leisure to think, to analyze, to organize, and make sense of all that had impressed itself upon my eyes. But there wasn't a moment of rest and peace to be had here in the crowded deck. The lines of a book I was trying to read blurred as the fleeting shadows of the chattering passengers moved by, and it was impossible to be alone with myself, unshaded and busy in thoroughfare of the deck of this ship. And I tried for 3 days, resigned to my lot, and I watched the passengers and the sea. But the sea was always the same, blue and empty, and only at sunset was it abruptly flooded with every imaginable color. And as far for the passengers, after 22 hours, I knew them all by heart. Every face was tediously familiar. The woman's shrill laughter no longer irritated me, and even the loud voices of 2 Dutch officers quarreling nearby were not such a source of annoyance anymore, and there was nothing for it but to escape the deck. Although my cabin was hot and stuffy, and the saloon and in the saloon English girls kept playing waltzes, ballet on the piano in staccato fashion. And finally I decided to turn the day's normal timeline upside down, and in the afternoon, having anesthetized myself with a few glasses of beer, I went to my cabin to sleep throughout the evening with its dinner and the dancing. And when I awoke, it was dark and oppressive in the little coffin of my cabin, and I had switched off the ventilator so the air around my temples felt greasy and humid, and my senses were bemused, and it took me some minutes to remember my surroundings and wonder what time it was. And it must have been after midnight anyway, for I could not hear the music or those restless footsteps pacing overhead, and only the engine, the beating heart of the Leviathan, throbbed as it thrust the whole body of the ship into the unseen. And I made my way up the deck, and it was deserted, and as I looked about the steam from the funnel and the ghostly gleam of the stars, a magical brightness suddenly met my eyes, and the sky was radiant dark behind the white stars, and wheeling through it and yet radiant as if the velvet curtain up there veiled a great light, and the twinkling stars were merely gaps and cracks to which the indescribable brightness shone, and I had never seen before seen the sky as I saw it that night, glowing with such radiance, hard and steely blue, and yet liking sparkling and dripping and pouring and gushing down, falling from the moon and the stars as if burning in some mysterious inner space. And the white painted outlines of the ship stood out bright against the velvety dark in the moonlight, while out of the detailed contours of the ropes the yards dissolved in the flowing brilliance, and the lights on the mast seemed to hang in the space with the round eye of the lookout post above them, and the earthly yellow stars amidst the shining stars of the sky. And right above my head stood the magical constellation of the Southern Cross, hammering its invisible void with shining diamond nails, and seeming to hover, although only the ship was really moving, quivering slightly as it made its way up and down, heaving breath, up and down, the gigantic swimmer passing through the dark waves. And I stood there looking up, and I felt as if I were bathed by warm water falling from above, except that it was light washing over my hands, mild white light pouring around my shoulders and my head, and seeming to permeate me entirely, for all at once everything was somber about me was brightly lit. And I breathed freely, purely, and full of sudden delight, and I felt the air on my lips like a clear drink, and it was soft, effervescent air carrying on it the aroma of fruits and the sweet of distant lands, and making me slightly drunk. And now for the first time I had set foot on the ship's planks, and I knew the blessed joy of reverie, and the other more sensual pleasures of abandoning my body, woman-like, to the softness surrounding me. And I wanted to lie down and look up at the white hieroglyphs in the sky. Both the loungers and deck chairs had been cleared away, and there was nowhere for me to rest and dream on the deserted Promagate deck. So I made my way down, gradually approaching the bows of the ship, and dazzled by the light that seemed to be shining more and more intensely and everything around me, and it almost hurt, that bright, glaring, burning starlight. And I wanted to find a place to lie down on the mat in the deep shade, feeling the glow not on me but only above me, reflected in the ship's gear around me as sees landscape from the darkening room. And at last, stumbling over the cables and past the iron hoist, I reached the ship's side and looked over the keel to see the bows moving into the darkness, and while molten moonlight spread out, foaming up on both sides of their path, and the ship kept rising and falling and rising and falling in the flowing dark, and cutting through the black water as it plows cuts through the soil. And in that sparkling interplay, I felt all the torment of the conquered elements and all the pleasure of the earthly power. And as I watched, I lost a sense of time, and did I stand there for an hour, or was it only a few minutes? And the vast crater of the ship moving up and down rocked me away from time to time, and I felt only a pleasant weariness coming over me, and a sensuous feeling, and I wanted to sleep, to dream, yet I did not wish to leave this magic and go back down into my coffin. And I instantly felt about my foot and found a coil of ropes. And I sat down on it, and my eyes closed, yet not fully darkened, for For above them and above me the glimmering glow streamed on, and below me I felt the water rushing quietly on, and above me the white torrent flowed with inaudible resonance, and gradually the rushing sound passed into my blood, and I was no longer conscious of myself, and I didn't know if I was heard my own breathing or the distant throbbing heart of the ship, and I myself was streaming, pouring away in the never-resting midnight world as it raced past. A dry, harsh cough quite close to me made me jump. I came out of my half-intoxicated reverie with a start in my eyes, which, even though close-lipped, had dazzled by the white brightness, now searched around. Quite close and opposite in me, a shadow of the ship's side. Something glinted like light reflected off a pair of glasses, and now I saw the concentrated and circular glow of a lighted pipe, and as I sat down, looking only below at the foaming bows, as they cut through the waves or up in the Southern Cross, and I had obviously failed to notice my neighbor, who must have been sitting here perfectly still all the time, and instinctively my reaction still slow, I said in German, "Oh, I do apologize." "Don't mention it," replied the voice in the darkness in the same language. I can't say how strange and eerie it was to be sitting next to someone like that in the dark, very close to a man I couldn't see, and I felt as if he were staring at me just as I was staring at him, but the flowing, shimmering white light above us was so intense that neither of us could see more than the other had his outline in the shadows. And I thought I could hear his breathing and the faint hissing sound as he drew in on his pipe, but that was all. The silence was unbearable, and I wanted to move away, but that seemed too sudden, and in my embarrassment I took out a cigarette, and the match spluttered, and for a second its light flickered over this narrow space where we were sitting, and I saw the stranger's face behind the lenses of his glasses, a face I had never seen on board at any meal or on the promenade deck, and whether the sudden flame hurt the man's eyes or whether it was just an illusion, his face suddenly seemed dreadfully distorted, dark and goblin-like. But before I could make out any details, darkness swallowed up the fleeting illuminated features again, and I saw only the outline of the figure darkly imprinted in the darkness, and sometimes the circular fiery light of the bowl of the pipe hovering in space, and neither of us spoke, and our silence was sultry and oppressive as the tropical air itself. Finally, I could stand it no longer, and I stood up and said, a civil "Good night." "Good night," came the reply from the darkness in a hoarse, harsh, rusty voice, and I stammered forward with some difficulty over the hawsers and passed on post. And then I heard footsteps behind me, hasty and uncertain, and it was my companion of a moment ago, and I instantly stopped, and he did not come up right up to me, though the darkness I sensed something like anxiety and awkwardness in his gait. "Forgive me," he said quickly. "If I must ask you a favor, he stammered for a moment, too embarrassed to go on at once. "I have a very private reason for staying out of sight. A bereavement, and I prefer to avoid company on board. Oh, I don't mean you, no. I just like to ask, well, I would be very much obliged if you wouldn't mention seeing me here to anyone on board. There are private reasons, I might call them, to keep me from mingling with the people just now. Yes, well, it would put me in an awkward position if you mentioned that someone here at night and that I..." And he stopped again, and I put an end to his confusion at once by assuring him that I would do as he wished. And we shook hands, and then I went back to my cabin and slept a heavy, curious, disturbed sleep, and troubled by strange images. I kept my promise and told no one aboard of my strange meeting, although the temptation to do so was great. For on a sea voyage, every little thing becomes an event. A sail on the horizon, a dolphin leaping, a new flirtation, a joke made in passing. And I was full of curiosity to know more about the vessel's unusual passenger, and I searched the ship's list for a name that might be his, and I scrutinized the other people, wondering if they could be somehow related to him. All day I was prey to my nervous impatience, just waiting for evening and wondering if I could meet him again. and all psychological states have positively quieting power over me, and I find tracking down the reasons for them very intriguing, and the mere presence of unusual characters can kindle a passionate desire in me to know more about them, a desire not so much less strong than a woman's wish to acquire some possession. The days seemed long and crumbled tediously away between my fingers, and I went to bed early knowing that my curiosity would wake me at midnight. And sure enough, I awoke at the same time as before, and the two hands of the illuminated dial of my clock covered one another in the single bright line. And I quickly left my sultry cabin and climbed into an even sultrier night. And the stars were shining as they shone yesterday, casting a diffuse light over the quivering ship, and the Southern Cross blazed high overhead, and it was all just the same as yesterday, and whether days and nights in the tropics resemble each other more than our latitudes. But I myself in a field yesterday saw a flowing, dreamy sensation of being gently cradled. Something was drawing me on, confusing me, and I knew where it was taking me, to the black hoist by the ship's side, to see if my mysterious acquaintance was sitting immobile there again. And I heard the ship's bell striking above me, and it urged me on. Step by step, reluctantly yet fascinated, I followed my instinct, and I had not yet reached the prow of the ship when something like a red eye suddenly hovered in front of me. The pipe. So he was there. I instinctively stepped back and stopped, and next moment I would have left again, but there was a movement over there in the dark. Something rose and a couple of steps, and suddenly I heard his voice very close to mine, civil and melancholy. "Forgive me," he said. "You obviously want to sit there again, and I have a feeling that you hesitated when you saw me. Do please sit down and I'll go away." I made a haste to say he was very welcome to stay, as far as I was concerned, and I stepped back and I said only for fear of disturbing him. "Oh, you don't disturb me," he said, and with some bitterness. "Far from it, I am glad to have company for a change, and I haven't spoken to anyone for 10 days. Well, not for years, really, and it seems so difficult, perhaps because forcing it all back onto itself chokes me. I can't sit in my cabin anymore in that coffin, and I can't bear it, and I can't bear the company of human beings either, because they laugh all day, and I can't endure that now, and I hear it in my cabin and stop my ears against them, and of course they don't know that they don't know that, they don't know it, and what business is it theirs after all? They are strangers." He stopped again, and very suddenly and hastily. But I don't want to bother you. Forgive me for speaking so freely." He made a bow and was about to leave, but I urged him to stay. "You are not bothering me in the least. I am glad to have a few quiet words with someone I hear myself. May I offer you a cigarette?" He took one and lit it, and once again his face moved away from the ship's black side, flickering in the light of the match, but now he turned it fully to me, and his eyes behind his glasses looked inquiringly into my face, evidently with their demented force. And a shudder passed through me, and I could feel the man was wanted to speak and had to speak, and I knew that I must help him by saying nothing. And we sat down, and he had a second-deck chair there, and offered it to me, and our cigarettes glowed, and from the way that the light of the ring of the light traced by his darkness shook, and I could tell that his hand was trembling. But I kept silent, and so did he, and then suddenly he asked in a quiet voice, "Are you very tired?" "No, not at all." The voice in the darkness hesitated again. "I would like to ask you something. That is to say, I would like to tell you something." "Oh, I know. It must be very well how absurd it is to turn to the first man I met, but I'm in a terrible mental condition, and I have reached a point where I absolutely must talk to someone or it will be the end of me. You'll understand that if I tell you, and I know you can't help me, but this silence is almost making me ill, and a sick man always looks ridiculous to others." Here I interrupted, begging him not to distress himself, and he could tell me anything he liked, I said, and naturally I couldn't promise him anything, but to show willingness is a human duty, and if you see someone in trouble, I added, of course it is your duty to help. Duty, to show willing, a duty to try. So you too think it is a man's duty? Yes, his duty to show himself willing to help. He repeated it 3 times, and I shuddered at the blunt, grim tone of his repetition. Was the man mad? Or was he drunk? He could be both. As if I had uttered my suspicions aloud, he suddenly said in quite a different voice, "You may think me mad or drunk. No, I am not yet. Only what you said moved me so strangely, because that is exactly what torments me now, wondering if it is a duty. He was beginning to stammer again, and he broke off a moment and pulled himself together, and he began again. "The fact is, I am a doctor of medicine, and in that profession we often come upon such cases, such fateful cases, borderline cases, let's call them, when we don't know whether or not it is our duty, or rather whether there's more than one duty involved, and not just to another human being, but to ourselves, to the state, to science, yes, and of course we must help, and that's what we are there to do, but such maxims are never more than theory, and how far should we go to help? And here are you, a stranger to me, and I am a stranger to you, and I ask you not to mention seeing me, and well, so you don't say anything, you do your duty, and I ask you to talk to me because my own silence is killing me, and you say you're ready to listen. Good, bud. That's easy. Suppose I were to ask you to take hold of me and throw me overboard, though your willingness to help me will be over. The duty has to end somewhere, and it ends where we begin thinking of our own lives, of our own responsibilities. And it has to end somewhere. It has to end, or perhaps for doctors, of all people, it ought not to end. And must a doctor always come to the rescue and be ready to help one and all, just because he has a diploma full of Latin words? And must he really throw away his life and water down his own blood if some woman, if someone comes along and wanted him to do the noble, helpful good? And yes, duty ends somewhere. It ends where no more can be done, and that's where it ends." He stopped again, and he regained his control. All right, that's a good place to leave it. Bye bye and God bless. Stefan Zweig, Amok, Part 2. Forgive me, I know I sound agitated, but I'm not drunk, not yet, although I am often, and I'm freely confessing it in this hellish isolation. Bear in mind that for 7 years I live almost entirely with the local natives and with animals, and you forget how to talk calmly. And then if you open up, everything comes flooding out, but wait, yes, I know. I am going to ask you, and I wanted to tell you about a certain case and wondering whether you think one has a duty to help. Just help, with motives as pure as angels, or whether, although I fear it will be a long story. Are you sure you're not tired? Not in the least, thank you. Thank you, and will you have a drink? He had been groping in the darkness behind him and somewhere, and there was a clicking sound, and 2 were there, and at any rate several bottles ranged there, and he offered me a glass of whiskey, which I sipped briefly while he drained his glass in a draught. And then the ship bell struck midnight. Well then, I'd like to tell you about a case, and suppose that a doctor in a small town, or right in the country, a doctor who, and he stopped again, and then suddenly moved his chair closer to mine. This is no good. I must tell you everything directly, from the beginning, or you won't understand it. No, I can't put it as a theoretical case. I must tell you the story of my own case, and there'll be no shame about it, and I will hide nothing. And people streak naked in front of me, after all, and show me their scabs, their urine, their excrement. And if someone is to help, there can be no beating around the bush, no concealment. So if I won't describe the case of some fictional doctor, and I will strip myself naked and say that I forgot all the shame in that filthy isolation, that accursed country that eats the soul and sucks the marrow from a man's loins. And I must have made a movement of some kind, for he interrupted himself. "Ah, you protest. Oh, I understand. You are fascinated by the India, by its temple, the palm trees, and all the romance of a 2-month visit. Yes, the tropics are magical when you're traveling through the trail and road and rickshaw, and I felt just the same when I first arrived 7 years ago. And I had so many dreams, and I was going to learn the language and read the sacred text in original, and I was going to study the disease and do scientific work, explore the native psychic. And we will put it in the European jargon, and I was on a mission for humanity and civilization. Everyone who comes here dreams the same dream, but the man's strength ebbs away in this invisible hothouse. The fever strikes deep into him, and we all get the fever however much quinine we take, and he becomes listless, indolent, and flabby as a jellyfish. And as European, he is cut out from his true nature, so to speak, when he leaves the big city for some wretched swamp raiding station, and sooner or later we also come to our weaknesses. Some drink, others smoke opium, others again brawl and act like brutes, and some kind of folly comes over us, and we long for Europe, and we dream of walking down the street again some rainy, sitting among white people in a well-lit room in a solitary built house, and we dream of it year after year. And if the time does come, we could go and leave, and we're too listless to take the chance. And a man knows he's being forgotten back home, and he's a stranger there, a shell in a sea, and anyone can tread on him. So he stays and he degenerates and goes to the bad in these hot, humid jungles. And it was a bad day when I sold my service to that filthy place. Not that I did it entirely of my own free will. I had studied in Germany, and I was a qualified doctor, and indeed a good doctor. We suppose in a big hospital in Leipzig, and in some long forgotten issue of a medical journal, a great deal was made of a new injection that I was the first to introduce, and then I had trouble over a woman, and I met her in a hospital, and she had driven her lover so crazy that he shot her with a revolver, and soon I was as crazy as he had been. And she had a cold, proud manner that drove me to distraction, and a bold, domineering woman had always had a hold over me, but she tightened that hold until my bones were breaking. And I did what she wanted. Why not say it? It's 8 years now, and I dipped into the hospital's funds for her. And when it came time, when it came out, all hell was let loose. And an uncle of mine covered up for me when I was dismissed, but my career was over. So yeah, he stole for a hot woman. It was then that I heard that the Dutch government was recruiting doctors for the colonies and offered a lump sum in payment. Well, I understood at once the kind of job it would be if they were offering payment like that, for I knew that the crosses on the graves in the fever plantations grow 3 times as fast as at home. But when you're young, you think fever and death only affects others. However, I had little choice, and I went to Rotterdam and signed up for 10 years and was given a big bundle of banknotes. And I sent half home to my uncle, and as for the other half, a woman in the harbor days, they got it out of me, just because she was so like that vicious cat I loved. And I sailed away from Europe without money, without even a watch, without illusions, and I wasn't particularly sorry to leave the harbor. And then I sat on the deck like you, like everyone, and saw the Southern Cross and the palm trees, and then my heart rose. A forest, isolation, silence, a dream. Well, and I soon had enough of isolation, and I wasn't stationed at Batavia or Surabaya, in a city with other people and clubs and golf and books and newspaper. Instead, I went to, well, the name doesn't matter, to one of the distinct stations, 2 days' journey from the nearest town, and a couple of tedious designated officials and a few half-castes were all the society I had, and apart from that, nothing but miles around but jungle, plantations, thickets, and swamps. It was tolerable at first, and I pursued all kinds of study once, and when the vice president was on a journey of inspection and had a motor accident and broke a leg, and I operated him without assistance. And there was a lot of talk about it, and I collected native poisons and weapons, and I turned my attention to hundreds of little things to keep my mind alert. But that lasted only as long as the strength of Europe was still active in me, and then it dried up. The few Europeans on station bored me, and I stopped mixing with them, and I drank and I drank and I dreamed, and I had only 2 more years to go before I would be set free with pension, and I could go back to Europe and begin life again. And I wasn't really doing anything but waiting, and I lay low and waited. And that's what I was doing, and that's what I would be doing today if it hadn't happened. The voice in the darkness stopped, and the pipe had stopped glowing, and it was so quiet all of a sudden, and I could hear the water foaming as it broke against the keel, and the dull distant throbbing of the engines, and I would have liked to light a cigarette, but I was afraid that the bright flash of light and its reflection on his face, and he remained silent for a long time, and I didn't know if he had finished what he had to say or was dozing, or had fallen asleep so profound with his silence. And then the ship's bell struck, and a single powerful note, 1 o'clock, and he started, and I heard his glass clink again, and his hand was obviously feeling around for the whiskey, and a sharp gargle quietly into his glass, and then his voice suddenly began again, but now it seemed tenser and more passionate. So wait a moment. Oh yes, there I was, sitting in my damn cobweb, and I had been crouching motionless as a spider in its web for months. And it was just after the rainy seasons. Rain had poured down on the roof for weeks on end, and not a human being had come along, no European. And I'd been stuck there in the house day after day, with my yellow-skinned woman and my good whiskey, and I was feeling very down at the time, homesick for Europe, and if I read a novel describing clean sheets and white women, my fingers began to tremble. And I can't really describe the condition to you, but it's like a tropical disease, a raging feverishness, yet helpless nostalgia that sometimes comes over a man. So there I was, sitting over an atlas, and I sit dreaming of journeys. And then there's a hammering at my door, and my boy is there, and one of the women, eyes wide with amazement. They make a dramatic gesture, and there's a woman here, they say, a lady, a white woman. I jump up in surprise, and I didn't hear a carriage or a car approaching. A white woman here in the wilderness. And I was about to go down the steps, but then I pulled myself together, and I glanced in the mirror, and I hastily tidied myself. Restless, and I have an ominous foreboding, for I know no one in the world who be coming me to visit me out of friendship. And at last I go down, and the lady's waiting in the hall, and hastily comes to me, and a thick motoring veil hides her face, and I am about to greet her, but she's quick to get her word in first. Good day, doctor, she says in fluent English, it's slightly too fluent, as if she had learned her speech by heart in advance. Do forgive me for descending on you like this, but we have just been visiting the station, and our car is over there. And there a thought flashes through my mind, and why didn't she drive up to the house? And then I remember that you live here, and I heard so much about you. You work miracles for the vice president, and his leg is perfectly alright, and he can play golf as well as ever. And just imagine all of us in the city are still talking about it, and we're happily dispensed on our own cross-grained surgeon and the other doctors if you would only come to us instead. Now, why didn't you ever go to the city? You live like a yogi here. And so she shatters on faster and faster without letting me in getting a word. And her low cavity is nervous and agitated and makes me uneasy. And why is she talking so much? And I ask myself, why doesn't she introduce herself? And why doesn't she put her veil back? Is she feverish? Is she ill? Is she mad? I feel increasingly nervous, aware that I look ridiculous standing silently in front of her while her floodgates of chatter sweeps over me. At last she slows down slightly, and I am able to ask her upstairs, and she sighs to the boy to stay where he is, and goes to the stairs out with me. You have a nice place here, she says, and looking around the room. Ah, such lovely books, and I like to read them all. And she goes out to the bookcase and looks at the title. And for the first time I set eyes on her, and she falls silent for a minute. May I offer you a cup of tea? I ask. She doesn't turn, but just looks at the spines of the books. No, thank you, doctor, and we have to be off again in a moment, and I don't have much time, and this was just a little detour. I see you have Flaubert as well, and I love him so much. L'Education Sentimentale. Wonderful, really wonderful. So you read French too, and a man of many talents. Ah, you Germans. You learn everything at school, and how splendid to know so many languages. And the vice president swears by you, and he says that he wouldn't go under the knife with anyone else. And a residency surgeon is good for playing bridge, but the fact is, she said, still with her face turned away, and it crossed my mind today that I might consult you myself sometime, and since we happen to be passing by anyway, I thought, oh, but I'm sure you're very busy. I can come back at another time. Showing my hand at last, I thought, but I didn't show any reaction, and I merely assured her that it would be an honor to be of service to her now or whenever she liked. Oh, it's nothing serious, she said, half turning, and at the same time leafing through a book she had taken off the shelf. Nothing serious, just small things, woman's troubles, dizziness, fainting. And this morning I suddenly fainted as we were driving round the bend, and fainted right away, and the boy had to prop me up in the car and fetch water, but perhaps the chauffeur was just driving too fast. Do you think, doctor? I can't say just like that, and do you often have fainting fits? Oh no, that is, yes. Recently, in fact, yes. And I have such fainting fits and attacks of nausea. And she said, and she's standing in front of the bookcases again and pulls the books back and another out and rifles to the pages. Strange, and I think, why does she keep leafing to the pages so nervously? And why doesn't she look up behind the veil? And deliberately I say nothing, and I enjoy making her wait. And at last she starts talking again in her nonchalant, loquacious way. There's nothing to worry about, doctor, is there? No tropical disease, nothing dangerous? I have to see it if you're feverish first, and may I take your pulse? I approach her, but she moves slightly aside. No, I'm not feverish, certainly not. Certainly not, and I have been taking my own temperature every day since this fainting began. Never higher, always 36.4, and my digestion is healthy too. And I hesitate briefly, and all this time a suspicion has been lurking in the back of my mind, and a sense that this woman wants something from me, and you certainly don't go into the wilderness to talk about Flaubert. And I keep her waiting for a minute or two, and then I say straight out, forgive me, but may I ask you a few frank questions? Of course, doctor. You are a medical man after all, she replies, but she has her back turned to me again, and is playing with the books. Do you have children? Yes, a son. And did you previously, with your son, did you experience anything similar? Yes. Her voice is quite different now, very clear and firm, and no longer loquacious or nervous. And is it possible, forgive my asking, that you are now in the same situation? Translation, are you pregnant again? Yes. She utters the words in a tone as sharp and cutting as a knife, and her averted head does not move at all. Perhaps it would be best, ma'am, if I gave you a general examination. Maybe I perhaps ask you to go to the trouble of coming into the next room. And then she does turn suddenly, and I feel cold, determined gaze bend straight at me through her veil. No, that won't be necessary. I am fully aware of my condition. The voice hesitated for a moment, and then the glass that he had refilled shone briefly in the dark again. So listen, but first try to think a little about it for a moment. A woman forces herself on someone who is desperate with loneliness, and the first white woman in years to set foot in his room, and suddenly I feel that there is something wrong here, a danger, and a shiver runs down my spine, and I'm afraid of the steely determination of this woman, who arrived with her careless chatter and then suddenly came out with her demand like a knife. And for I knew what she wanted to do, and I knew at once, and it was not the first time women had made me such a request, but they approached me differently, ashamed or pleading, and they came to me with tears and entreaties, but here was a steely yet virile determination. And I felt from the second that this woman was stronger than me, and that she could force me to do what she wanted, and yet, There was some evil purpose in me and a man on his guard, some kind of bitterness for, as I said before, from the first second, indeed even before I had seen her, I sensed that this woman was an enemy. And at first I said nothing, and I remained doggedly, grimly silent, and I felt that she was looking at me under her veil, looking at me straight and challenging, and I felt that she wanted to force me to speak, but evasively or indeed unconsciously, and I emulated her casual, shattering manner, and I acted as if I didn't understand her, for I don't know if you can understand this. I wanted to force her to speak clearly, and I didn't want to offer anything, and I wanted to be asked, particularly by her, because her manner was so imperious, like he wanted her to beg him for help. Because I knew that I am particularly vulnerable to women with cold, proud manner. So I remained non-committal, saying that there was no cause for concern, if such fainting fits occur in natural course of events. Indeed, they almost guarantee a happy outcome. And I quoted cases from the medical press, and I talked and I talked smoothly, effortlessly, always suggesting that this was something very banal, and I kept waiting for her to interrupt me, because I knew that she wouldn't stand for it. And then she interrupted me sharply, waving aside all of my reassuring talk. That's not what worries me, doctor, and when my son was born, I was in better state of health, but now I am not alright anymore, and I have a heart condition. I have a heart condition, I repeated, apparently concerned. Oh, we must look into that at once, and I made it as if to stand to fetch my stethoscope. But she stopped me again, and her voice was very sharp and firm, like an officer on parade ground. I do have a heart condition, doctor, and I must ask you to believe what I tell you. And I don't want to waste a lot of time with examination, and I think you might show a little more confidence in me. For my part, I've shown sufficient confidence in you. Now it was a battle, an open challenge, and I accepted it. Confidence calls for frank disclosures with nothing held back. Speak frankly, I am a doctor, and for heaven's sake, take off that veil, sit down, and never mind the books and the roundaboutness. You don't go to visit a doctor in a veil. Proud and erect, she looked at me, and for a moment she hesitated, and then she sat down and she lifted her veil, and I saw the kind of face I feared to see, an impenetrable face, hard, controlled, a face of an ageless beauty, a face with gray English eyes in which all seemed at peace, and yet behind which one could dream of all that all was passion. And that narrow, compressed mouth gave nothing away if it didn't want to. And for a moment we looked at each other, and she commandingly, and at the same time inquiring with such cold, steely cruelty that I couldn't hold her gaze, but instantly looked away. She tapped nervously the table slightly with her knuckles. She was nervous, and then she said quickly and suddenly, Do you know what I want you to do for me, doctor, or don't you? I believe I do. But let's be quite plain about it. You want an end to your condition. You want me to cure you of your fainting fits and nausea by removing their cause. Is that it? Yes. The word felt like a guillotine, and then you know that such attempts are dangerous for both parties concerned. Yes. That I am legally forbidden to do such a thing. There are cases where it isn't forbidden but actually recommended. They call for a medical examination, however. Then you'll find such indications. You're a doctor. Clear and fixed, unflinching, her eyes looked at me as she spoke, and it was an order, a weakling that I am, and I trembled with admiration for her demonically imperious will. But I was evasive. I didn't want to show that I was already crushed, and so spark of desire in me said, Don't go too fast. Make difficulties. Force her to beg. That is not always within a doctor's competence, but I am ready to ask a colleague at the hospital. I don't want your colleague. I came to you. May I ask why? She looked coldly at me. I had no reservations about telling you, because you live in seclusion, because you don't know me, because you're a good doctor. And that's because, she added, hesitating for the first time, you probably won't stay here very much longer, particularly if you can go home with a large sum of money. I felt cold. The adamant commercial clarity of her calculated bemused me. So far her lips had uttered no request. She had already worked it all out, and she had been lying to wait for me and then track me down. And it felt the demonic force of her will entering me, but embittered as I was, I resisted. And once again I made myself sound objective, indeed almost ironic. Oh, you would, and would you place this large sum of money at my disposal for your help and then your immediate departure? Do you realize that I could lose my pension? I will compensate you. You are very clear in your mind about it, but I would like even more clarity. What sum do you envisage as a fee? 12,000 guilders payable for check when you reach Amsterdam. Alright, that's the end of that part. Bye bye and God bless. Amok, Part 3 by Stefan Zweig. I trembled with anger, and yes, with admiration again too, and she had worked it all out, the sum and the manner of its payment, which would oblige me to leave this part of the world, and she had assessed me and bought me before she even met me, and had an arrangement for me in anticipation of getting her own way. And I would have liked to strike her in the face, but as I stood there shaking, she too had risen to her feet, and I looked her straight in the eye. And the side of her closed mouth that refused to bleed, her haughty brow that would not bend, and a kind of violent desire overcame me. She must have felt something of it, for she raised her eyebrows, and as one would to dismiss a troublemaker. The hostility between us was suddenly in the open, and I knew she hated me because she needed me, and I hated her because she would not plead. In that one single second of silence, we spoke to each other honestly for the first time, and then an idea suddenly came over me, like the bite of a reptile, and I told her, but wait a moment, or you must misunderstand what I did. What I said. First, I must explain how that deranged idea came into my mind. Once again, the glass clicked softly in the dark, and the voice became more agitated. Not that I want to make excuses, justify myself, clear myself of blame, but otherwise you wouldn't understand. I don't know if I have ever been what I might be called a good man. But I think I was always helpful. In the wretched life I lived over there, the only pleasure I had was using that knowledge, was containing my brain to keep some living creature breathing, and an almost divine pleasure. So yeah, it's just one of the many doctors with a godlike complex. And the woman made the horrible sin of not begging him for help. It is a fact that those were my happiest moments. For an instant, when one of the natives came along, pale with fright, his swollen foot bitten by a snake, howling not to have his leg cut off, and I managed to save him. And I traveled for hours to see a woman in a fever, and asked for the kind of help my visitor wanted, and I already given that in the hospital in Europe. But then I could have at least feel that these people needed me, that I was saving someone from death or despair, and the feeling of being needed was my way of helping myself. But this woman, I don't know if I can describe it to you, she had irritated me and intrigued me from the moment when she had arrived, and apparently just strolling casually in, and her provocative arrogance made me resist, and she caused everything in me that was, how shall I put it, everything in me that was oppressed, hidden, wicked, to oppose her, playing the part of the great lady, meddling in matters of life and death with inappropriate aplomb. It drove me mad, and then, after all, no woman gets pregnant just from playing golf. And I knew that is to say, I reminded myself with terrible clarity, and this is when my idea came to me, and that this cool, haughty-colored woman, raising her eyebrows above her steely eyes, if I so much as looked at her Akestans and parry her demands and had been rolling in bed with a man in the heat of passion 2 or 3 months ago, naked as an animal and perhaps groaning with desire, and their bodies pressed as close as a pair of lips, and that the idea burning in my mind as she looked at me with such unapproachable coolness, proud as an English army officer, and then everything in me braced itself, and I was possessed by the idea of humiliating her, and from that moment on, I felt I could see her naked body through her dress. And from that moment on, I lived for nothing but the idea of taking her, forcing a groan from her hard lips, feeling this cold, arrogant woman a prey to desire like everyone else, and as that other man had done, the man I didn't know. And that's what I wanted to explain to you. Low as I am sunk, I had never before thought of exploiting such a situation as a doctor, and this time it wasn't a desire, the rotting instinct, nothing sexual. I swear it wasn't, I can vouch for it, just a wish to break her pride, to dominate her as a man. And I think I told you that I have always been susceptible to proud, apparently cold women. And add to that the fact that I had lived here for 7 years without sleeping with a white woman, and had met with no resistance, for the girls here, twinkling fragile little creatures who tremble with awe as if a white man, a master, takes them, and they efface themselves in humility, and they're always available, always at your service with their soft, gurgling laughter. But that submissive, slavish attitude in itself spoils the pleasure. So you can understand the shattering effect on me when a woman full of pride and hostility suddenly came along, reserving every fiber of her being, glittering with mystery, and at the same time carrying the burden of an earlier passion. And when such a woman boldly enters the cage of a man like me, lonely, starved, isolated brute of a man, well, that's what I wanted to tell you, just so that you understand the rest of what happened next. And so full of some kind of wicked greed, poisoned by the thought of her stripped naked, sensuous and submitting, and I pulled myself together with pretended indifference, and I said coolly, 12,000 guilders? No, I won't do it for that. And she looked at me, turning a little pale, and she probably sensed already that my refusal was not a matter of avarice, but she said, then what do you want? I was not putting up with her cool tone anymore. And let's show our hands, shall we? I am not a tradesman, and I am not the poor apothecary in Romeo and Juliet, who sells his poisons for corrupted gold, and perhaps I am the opposite of the tradesman, and you won't get what you want by those means. So you won't do it? Not for money. And all was very still between us for a second, so still that for the first time I heard her breathing. What else can you want then? Now I could control myself no longer. First, I want you to stop speaking to me as if I were a tradesman and address me like a human being. And when you need help, I don't want you to come straight out with your shameful offer of money, but to ask me to help you as one human being to another. And I'm not just a doctor, and I don't spend all my time in consultations, and I spend some of it in other ways too. And perhaps you have come at such a time. And she says nothing for a moment, and then her lips curls and very slightly trembles, and then says quickly, then if I were to ask you, would you do it? You're trying to drive a bargain again, and you won't ask me unless I promise first, and you must ask me first, and then I will give you an answer. And she tosses her head like a defiant horse, and looks angrily at me. No, I will not ask you. I'd rather go to ruin. And that anger seized upon me, red and senseless. Then if you won't ask, I will make my own demand, and I don't think I have to put it crudely. You know what I want from you, and then I will help you. She stared at me for a moment, and then, oh, I can't tell you how terrible it was. And then her features froze, and then she suddenly laughed. You want me to put out? And she laughed at me with unspeakable contempt in her face, contempt that was scarred all over me, and at the same time intoxicated me, and that the rising laughter was like a sudden explosion, breaking out so abruptly and with such monstrous force, and behind it that I could have sunk to the ground and kissed her feet, and it lasted only a second, and it was like lightning, and it had set my whole body on fire. And then she turned and went quickly to the door, and I instantly moved to her to apologize, to beg her well, and my strength was entirely broken, and she turned once more and said, "No order. Don't dare to follow me or try to track me down. You would regret it." And then the door slapped shut behind her. Cause like, oh my God, I said something just awful, and then like, oh my God, and then she just left. Another hesitation, another silence, and there was only the faint rushing sound as if moonlight pouring down. And then at last the voice spoke again. The door slammed, but I stood there motionless on the spot as if hypnotized by her order. And I heard her go downstairs, open the front door, and I heard it all, and my whole will urged me to follow her, to, I don't know, to call her back, to strike her, strangle her, but to follow her. And yet I couldn't. My limbs were crippled as if were by an electric shock. And I have been cut to the quick by the imperious gleam of those eyes, and I know there's no explaining it, and it can't be described. And it may sound ridiculous, but I just stood there, and it was several minutes, 5, perhaps 10 more, before I could raise a foot to the floor. But no sooner had I moved that foot than I instantly, swiftly, feverishly hurried down the stair. And she could only have gone along the road back to civilization, and I hurried to the shelf to my bicycle, and I finally had forgotten the door key, and I wrenched the lock off and splitting and breaking the bamboo shed door, and the next moment I am on my bicycle hurrying after her. And I have to reach to her, I must, before she gets back to her car, and I must speak to her, and the road rushes past me, only now do I realize how long I must have stood there motionless, and then where the road stood throughout the forest bends just before reaching the buildings of their district station, and I see her hurrying along, stepping firmly, walking straight, and I had accompanied by her boy. But she must have seen me too, for now she speaks to the boy, who stands behind while she goes on alone. And what is she doing, and why does she want to be on her own, and does she want to speak to me out of hearing? And I pedal faster, furiously, and then something suddenly springs into my path. It's the boy, and I'm only just in time to sever and fall, and I rise cursing involuntarily, and I raise my fist to hit the fool, but he leaps aside, and I pick up the bicycle to remount him. But then the scoundrel lurches forward and takes hold of the bicycle and says in his pitiful English, "You not go on. You shall not pass." What sounded better? You haven't lived in the tropics, you don't know how unheard of it is for the yellow bastard like that to seize the bicycle of a white master and to tell him, the master, to stay where he is. And instead of answering, I strike him in the face with my fist, and he staggers but keeps hold of the bicycle, and his eyes, his narrow, frightened eyes, are wide open in slavish fear, but he holds to the handbars infernally tight. "You not go on," he stammers, "and it's lucky I don't have my revolver with me or I'll shoot him down. Out of the way, scum," is all I say, and he cringes and stares at me, but he does not let go of the handle. And at this rage comes over me, and I see that she's well away, and she may be escaped me entirely. And I hit him under the shin with a boxer sponge and send him flying. And now I have my bicycle again, but as I jump on the mechanism jams, and a stroke has bent on the tussle, and I try to straighten it with a trembling hand, and I can't, so I fling the bicycle across the road at the scoundrel, who gets up bleeding and flinches aside. And you know you won't understand how ridiculous it is. It must look to everyone there for a European. Well, anyway, I don't know what I was doing anymore, and I had only one thought in mind, to go after her, to reach her. And so I ran like a madman along the road past the huts where the yellow riffraffs were gathering in amazement to see a white man, the doctor, running. And I reached the station dripping with sweat, and my first question is, where is the car? Just driven away. And people stare at me in surprise, and I must look to them like a lunatic, arriving wet and muddy and screaming my question ahead of me before coming to a halt. And down in the road I see the white fumes of the car exhaust, and she has succeeded just as all of her harsh cruelty, harsh calculations must succeed. But flight won't help her, and there are no secrets among Europeans in the tropics. Everyone knows everyone else, and everything is notable event. And not for nothing did her driver spend an hour in the government bungalow in a few minutes, and I know all about it, and I know who she is, and I know that she lives in, well, in the capital of a colony, 8 hours from there here to the rail, and I know that she is, let's say, the wife of a big businessman, enormously rich, distinguished, an English woman, and I know that her husband has been in America for 5 months and is to arrive the next day to take her back to Europe with him. On the meanwhile, the thought burns in my veins like poison. Meanwhile, she can't be more than 2 or 3 months pregnant. And so far, I hope I have made it easy for you to understand, but perhaps only because up to that point I understood myself as a doctor I could diagnose my own condition. And from now on, however, something began to work in me like a fever. I lost control, that is to say, I knew exactly how pointless everything I did was, but I had no power over myself. And I no longer understood myself. I was merely racing forward, obsessed by my purpose. No way, perhaps I can make you understand it after all. Do you know what the expression running amok means? Roll credits. Running amok, yes, I think I do. A kind of intoxication affecting the Malay. It is more than an intoxication, it is a madness, a sort of human rabies, an attack of murderous, pointless monomania that bears no comparison with ordinary alcohol or poisoning. And I studied several cases myself during my time in the East, and it is easy to be very wise and objective about other people, but I was never able to uncover the terrible secret of its origin, and it may have something to do with the climate, the sultry, oppressive atmosphere that weighs down on the nervous system, like a storm until it suddenly breaks. Well then, this is how it goes. A Malay, an ordinary good-natured man, sits and drinking his brew, impassive, indifferent, apathetic, and just as I was sitting in my room, when suddenly he leaps to his feet and snatches his dagger and runs into the street, going straight ahead of him, and always straight ahead with no idea of his destination. With his krisis, that's his sword. With his krisis strikes down anything that crosses his path, man or beast. And this murderous frenzy makes him even more deranged, and he froths at the mouth, and as he runs he howls like a lunatic. But he still runs, and he doesn't look right, and he doesn't look left, and he just runs on screaming, shrilling, and brandishing his blood-stained kriss as he forges straight ahead in a dreadful way, and the people of the village know that no power can halt the man running amok. So they shout warnings ahead when they see him coming, "Amok! Amok!" And everyone flees, but he runs without hearing and without seeing, striking down anything he meets until he's either shot dead like a mad dog, or collapses on his own accord, still frothing at the mouth, like ravenous. I once saw a case from the window of my bungalow, and it was a terrible sight, but it's only because I saw it that I can now understand myself in those days, because I storm off like that, just like that, obsessed in the same way, going straight ahead with a dreadful expression, seeing nothing to the right or to the left, following the woman. And I don't remember exactly what I did. It all went in such a breakneck speed, with such mindless haste. And 10 minutes, no 5, no 2, and after I had found out all about the woman, her name, where she lived, her story, I was racing back to my house to borrow the bicycle, and I threw a suit over my case, and took some money, and I drove to the railway station in my carriage, and I went without informing the district officer, without finding a locum for myself, and I left the house just as it was, unlocked, and the servant was standing around. The astonished women were all asking questions. And I didn't answer, didn't turn, and drove to the station and took the next train to the city, and only an hour after the woman had entered my room, and I had thrown my life away and was running amok, catering into the empty space. And I ran straight on, headlong, and I arrived in the city at 6 in the evening and 10 past 6, and I was at her house asking to see her. And it was, well, as you will understand, it was the pointless, stupid thing I would have done. But a man runs amok with empty eyes, and he doesn't see where he's going. And the servant came back after a few minutes, cool and polite, and his mistress was not well and couldn't see anyone. And I staggered away, and I prowled around the house for an hour, possessed by the insane hope that she might perhaps come looking for me. And only then did I book into the hotel on the beach and went into my room, with 2 bottles of whiskey which, with a dose of Venerol, helped me calm, and at last I fell asleep, and that dull, troubled sleep was the only momentary respite in my race between life and death. The ship's bell sounded, and 2 heartful strokes, and a vibrant trembling in the soft pool near motionless airs that ebb away in the quiet, endless rushing in the water, washing around the keel, and its sounds mingling with the passionate tale, and the man opposite of me in the dark must have started in alarm, for his voice hesitated, and once again I heard his hand move down to find his bottle, and a soft gurgling, and then as I reassured him, he began again in a firmer voice. I can scarcely tell you about the hours I passed from that moment, and I think today that I was in a fever at the time, and at least I was in a state of overstimulation bordering on madness, as I told you, and I was running amok. But don't forget it was Tuesday night when I arrived, and on Saturday, as I was now discovered, her husband was to arrive on the P.O. steamer from Yokohama. And so there were just 3 days left, 3 brief days for the decision to be made and for me to help her. And you'll understand that I knew I must help her at once, and yes, I couldn't speak to her, and my need to apologize for my ridiculous, deranged behavior drove me on. I said, "Dude, I'm sorry I asked for such an indecent request. I'm sorry." I knew how valuable every moment was, and I knew that it was a matter of life and death to her, and yet I had no opportunity of approaching her with so much of a whisper aside, because my temperate foolishness in chasing after her had frightened her off. And it was, yes, it was like running after someone, warning them that a murderer is on the way, and that the person thinks that you are the murderer yourself, and so runs on to ruin. And she saw me only as a man running amok, pursuing her in order to humiliate her. But and this was the terrible absurdity of it, I wasn't thinking of that anymore. I was destroyed already. I just wanted to help her, do her a service. And I would have committed murder, any crime to help her, but she didn't understand that. And when I woke up in the morning and went straight back to her house, the boy was standing in the doorway, and the servant whose face I had punched. And when he saw me coming, he must have been looking out for me. He hurried through the door, and perhaps he went in only to announce my arrival discreetly. And perhaps all that uncertainty how it torments me now, and perhaps everything was already received me. But then when I saw him, I remembered my disgrace, and this time I didn't even dare try calling her again. And I was weak at knees, and I just before reaching the door, and I turned and went away while she perhaps was waiting for me in a similar state of torment. I didn't know what to do in this strange city that seemed to burn like fire beneath my feet, and suddenly I thought of something, called for a carriage, and went to see the vice president, on whose leg I had operated back, and at some distinct station, and I had myself announced. And something in my appearance must have seemed strange, for he looked at me with slight alarm, and there was an uneasiness about his civility, and perhaps he recognized me as a man running amok. And I told him briefly that I wanted to transfer to a city, and I couldn't exist in my present post any longer. And I said I had to move at once, and he looked at me, and I can't tell you how he looked at me, and perhaps as a doctor looks at a sick man. "A nervous breakdown, my dear doctor," he said. "I understand that only too well, and I'm sure it can be arranged. But wait, let's say 4 weeks while I find a replacement." Oh, bye. That's the end of that part. Bye-bye. God bless. Amok, Part 4 by Stefan Zweig. I can't wait even a day," I replied. Again he gave me a strange look. "You must, doctor," he said gravely, "and we can't leave the station without a medical man. But I promise you I'll set everything in motion this very day." And I stood there with my teeth gritted for the first time, and I felt clearly that I was a man whose service had been bought. I was a slave, and I was preparing to defy him when, diplomat that he was, he got his word in first. "You're unused to mixing with other people, doctor, and in the end that becomes an illness. And we're all being surprised that you never came here to the city or went on leave. And you need more company, more stimulation. Do at least come to the government reception this evening, and you'll find the entire colony and many others have long wanted to meet you, and they often ask about you and hope to see you here." And that last remark pulled me short, and people have asked about me. Could he mean her? And I was suddenly a different man, and I immediately thanked him courteously for his invitation and assured him that I would be there punctually. and punctual. I was over-punctual, and I hardly have to tell you that, driven by my impatience, I was the first in the great hall of the government building, surrounded by the silent, yellow-skinned servant whose bare feet hurried back and forth, and who, it seems to me, in my confused state of mind, were laughing at me behind my back. For a quarter of an hour, I was the only European among all of the soundless preparations, so alone with myself that I could hardly hear the ticking of my watch in my waistcoat, and then the few government officials at last appeared with their families, and finally the governor to enter, and he drew me into a long conversation in which I assiduously and I think carefully played my part suddenly attacked by the mysterious attack of nerve, I lost all of my diplomatic manner and began stammering. And although my bag was at the entrance of the hall, I suddenly felt that she must have entered and was present there. And I can't tell you how suddenly and certainly confused me, but even as I was talking to the governor, I heard his words echoing in my ears. And I sensed her presence somewhere behind me, and luckily the governor soon ended the conversation, or I think I was suddenly and abruptly had turned, and so strongly was the mysterious tugging of my nerves, and so burning and agitated my desire, and the thought I had hardly turned before I saw her, and exactly where my senses had unconsciously guessed she would be, and she wore a yellow ball dress that would have her slender, immaculate shoulders glow like dull ivory, and was walking to a group of guests. And she was smiling, but I thought that there was a tense expression on her face. And I came closer, and she either could not or would not see me, and looked at a very attractive smile civilly hovering on her narrow lips, and that smile intoxicated me again because I already knew it was a lie born of an art or an artifice, a masterful deception, and today was Wednesday, I thought. And on Saturday the ship with her husband on board would arrive, and how can she smile like that, so confidently, with such carefree look, and casually playing with her fan, and whose instead of a crushing out in fear, and I a stranger. And I have been trembling for 2 days at the thought of this moment, and stranger to her as I was, I experienced her fear and horror intensely, and she herself went to this ball, and smiled. And music started to play at the back of the hall, and the dancing began, and an elderly officer had asked her to dance, and she left the shattering circle with a word of excuse and walked down his arm towards the other hall and past me, and when she saw me her face suddenly froze, but only for a second, and then before I could make up my mind whether or not to greet her, she gave me a civil nod of recognition, and as she would do to a chance acquaintance, "Good evening, doctor," and was gone. And no one could have guessed what that green-gray glance concealed, and I don't know myself. And why did she speak to me? Why did she suddenly acknowledge me? Was it a rejection? Was it a rapprochement? And was it just embarrassment of my surprise? And I can't describe the agitation into which I was cast, and everything was in turmoil, exploited, concentrated within me. And as I saw her like that, casually waltzing in the officer's arm, with such cool, carefree look on her brow, while I knew that she, like me, was thinking of only one thing, that we two alone, out of everyone here, had a terrible secret in common, and she was waltzing well. In the few seconds, my fear, my longing, my admiration became more passionate than ever, and I don't know if anyone was watching me, but certainly my conduct gave away no more than hers. And I just could not look in any other direction, and I absolutely had to look at her from a distance, and my eyes fastening on her closed face to see if the mask would not drop for a second, and she must have found the force of my gaze uncomfortable. And as she moved away on her dancing partner's arm, she glanced my way for a split second with imperious sharpness, as if repelling me, and once again that little frown of haughty anger, the one I knew already, disfigured her brow. But as I told you, I was running amok, and I looked neither to the right or left, and I understood her at once. Her glance said, "Don't attract attention, control yourself." I knew that how can I put it, that she expected me to behave discreetly here in the hall and in public. And I realized that if I went home at this point, I could be certain that she would see me in the morning, and that she wanted to avoid just now being exposed to my obvious familiarity with her. And I knew she feared, and rightly, that my clumsiness would cause a scene, and you see, I knew everything. I understood that strong, imperious, gray gaze, but my feelings were too strong, and I had to speak to her. So I moved unsteadily over the growth where she stood, and talking and joining his loose-knit circle, although I knew only a few people in it, and merely in the hopes of hearing her speak, and yet always flinching from her eyes timidly like a whipped dog, and they coldly rested on me as there were one linen curtains hanging behind me, or the air that tightly moved it, but I stood there thirsty for a word spoken to me, for a sign of our understanding, and I stood like a block gazing at her amidst all of the shatter. And it cannot have passed unnoticed, for no one addressed a word to me, and she had suffered my ridiculous presence. And I don't know how long I would have stood there, for perhaps I could not have that enchantment of my own volition, and the very force of my freezing crippled me, but she could not bear it any more, and she suddenly turned to the gentleman, with a magnificent ease that came natural to her, and said, "I am a little tired. I think I'll go to bed early for once. Good night." And she was walking past me with a distant social nod of her, and I could see the frown in her face, and then nothing more but the back, and her white, cool, bare back. And it was a second before I realized that she was leaving, and that I wouldn't be able to see her or speak to her again this evening, and this last evening before I could help her. And for a moment I stood there rooted on the spot until I realized it, and then... But wait, you will not understand how stupid and pointless what I did was, and I must describe the whole room to you first. And I was in the great hall of the government building, entirely illuminated by lights and almost empty. And the couples had gone into the other room to dance, and gentlemen had gone to play cards, and only a few groups were still talking in the corners. So the hall was empty, and every moment conspicuous and visible in the bright light. And she walked slowly and lightly to the great hall with her shoulders straight, exchanging greetings now and then with indescribable composure, and with a magnificent, frozen, proud calm that enchanted me. And I had stayed behind, I told you, as if paralyzed, before I realized that she was leaving. And then, when I did realize, she was already at the far side of the hall, just approaching the doors. And then, I am still ashamed of it now. Something came over me, and I ran, do you hear? I did not walk, but ran to the hall after her, and my shoes clattering on the floor, and I heard my own footsteps, and I saw all eyes turning in me in surprise, and I could have died of shame, and even as I ran, I understood my own derangement, but I could not go back, and I caught up with her in the doorway, and she turned to me, and her eyes stabbed like gray steel, and her nostrils were quivering with anger. And I was just going to stammer something when she suddenly laughed out loud, in a clear, carefree, wholehearted laugh, and said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Oh, doctor, have you only just remembered my little boy's prescription?" "Ah, you learned scientist." A couple of people standing by laughed kindly, and I understood and was shattered by the masterful way she had saved the situation. And I put my hand in my wallet and tore a bank leaf on my prescription block, and she took it casually again with a cold smile of sense before she went, and for a second I felt easy in my mind. I saw her skill in dealing with my blunder, and that made off with things, but the next moment I knew that all was over for me, and that she hated me for my intemperable folly, hated me worse than death itself. And I could see her door hundreds upon hundreds of times, and she would always have me turn away like a dog, and I stammered through the room, and I realized that the people were looking at me, and I must have appeared strange. And I went to the buffet and drank 2, 3, 4 glasses of cognac one after another, which saved me from collapsing. And my nerves couldn't bear no more, and there were shreds, and then I slunk out to the side of the entrance as secretly as a criminal, and not for any principality in the world could I have walked back to the hall with her carefree laughter still echoing through these halls. And I went, and I really can't say now exactly where I went, but into a couple of bars where I got drunk like a man trying to drink his consciousness away, but I could not numb my senses, and the laughter was there in me, high and dreadful, and I could only silence the damn laughter. And I wandered around the harbor, and I had left my revolver in my room, or I would have shot myself, and I could think of nothing else. And with that I thought, and I went back to the hotel with one idea in mind, and the left-hand drawer at the chest where my revolver lay, and with that single idea in mind. That's the end of that chapter. But Amok, Part 5. The fact that I didn't shoot myself after all, I thought it wasn't cowardice, and it would have been a release to take out the safety cache and press the cold trigger. And how can I explain it? I still felt I had a duty, yes, that damn duty to help. And the thought that she might still need me, that she still needed me, made me mad. And it was Tuesday morning before I was back in my room, and on Saturday, as I had told you, on Saturday that she would come in, and I knew that this woman, this proud, haughty woman, would not survive being shamed before her husband and the world. And how my thoughts tortured me, thoughts of me, the precious time I had on thinking wasted and with crazy haste that had towards any profit of bringing her help in time. For hours, I swear. 4 hours on the end, I paced up and down my room, racking my brains to think of a way to approach her. What matters, right, her help. For I was certain that she wouldn't let me in her house now, and her daughter was still there in all my nerves, and I still had her nostrils her laughter was still there in all my nerves. And I still saw her nostrils quivering with anger, and for hours I paced up and down the 3 meters of my cramped room, and day had dawned and morning was already here. And suddenly an idea sent me to the desk, and I snatched up a sheet of notepad and began to write to her, write it all down, a whining, servile letter in which I begged her forgiveness, called myself a madman, a criminal, and begged her to entrust herself to me. And I swore that the hour after I was done, I would disappear from the city, from the colony, from the world if she wanted. Only she must forgive me and trust me to help her at last, and the very last minute. And I feverishly wrote 20 pages like this, and it must have been mad, indescribable letter, like a missive written in delirium, for when I rose from my dread desk, I was bathed in sweat. And the room swayed, and I had to drink a glass of water. Only then did I try reading the letter and thought again, but the very first words horrified me so. And I folded it up, trembling, and found an envelope, and suddenly a new thought came to me. And all at once I knew the crucial thing I to say, and I picked up a pen again and wrote the last sheet. I will wait here on the beach hotel for a word of forgiveness. If no answer comes by this evening, I shall shoot myself. Then I took the letter and ran for a boy, and I told him to deliver the envelope at once, and at last I had said everything. And suddenly it clicked and fell down beside us. And as he moved abruptly, he knocked over the whiskey bottle, and I heard his hand feeling for the deck of it. And then I picked it up in sudden vigor, and he threw the empty bottle high in the air and over the ship's side, and the voice fell silent for a few minutes, and then feverishly continued, even faster and more agitated than before. I am not believing Christian anymore, and I don't believe in heaven or hell. And if hell does exist, I am not afraid of it, for it can be worse than those hours I pass between morning and evening. Think of a small room, hot in the sunlight, red hot blazing noon. A small room, just a desk, a chair, and a bed, and nothing on the desk but the watch, and a revolver sitting in the desk, and a man who does nothing but stare at the desk and the second hand of his watch, and a man who eats and drinks nothing, doesn't smoke, doesn't move, who only listens to me, who only stares for 3 long hours at the white circle of the dial and the hand of the watch ticking as it goes around. And that was how I would spend the day, just waiting and waiting, but waiting like a madman running amok, senselessly like an animal with a headlong, direct persistence. Well, I won't try to describe those hours to you, and they are beyond description, and I myself don't understand now how one can go through such an experience without going mad. Then, at 22 minutes past 3, I remember the exact time. I sat staring at my watch, and there was a sudden knock on my door. And I leap up like a tiger leaping on its prey, and I bound across the room and the door, and I fling it open. Oh yeah, these thoughts that the main character's having about ending it all with a revolver, that's very important, because the writer Stefan Zweig in 1944, he shot himself and his wife because he fell into despair. But back to the story. So So this one, so the thoughts that the character is having is, you can almost see them as like projections of the writer projecting onto the character itself the feelings of despair. But while the character was despairing about not being able to help a woman, the writer was despairing about the fact that to him it seemed at the time that Hitler was going to win and conquer the world. And as a Jewish man living in exile, the thought of that, of like suffering to a concentration camp, fill him with dread. Well, let's continue moving on back to the story. Then 20 minutes past 2, and I was staring at the watch. I leap up and leap like a tiger on its prey, and in one bound I am across the room at the door, and I fling it open, and there stands a timid little Chinese boy with a folded note in his hand, and as I avidly reach for it, he scurries away, and it's gone, and I tear the note open to read it, and I find that I can't, and a red mist blurs my vision, and imagine my agony, and I have a word for her at last, and everything is quivering and dancing before my eyes, and I dip my head in the water and my sight clears. Once again, I take the note and read. Too late, but wait where you are. I may have yet sent for you. No signature on the crumbled paper, torn from some old brochure, and the writing of someone whose handwriting is unusually steady, not scribbling hastily, untidy in a pencil, and I don't know why the note shook me with so much, and some kind of horror, some mystery clung to it, and it might have been written in flight by somebody standing in the window way or moving vehicle. An unspeakable cold hour of fear, haste, terror about the fretted note chilled me to the heart, and yet I was happy. She had written to me, and I need not die yet, and I could help her, and perhaps I could. Oh, I lost myself in the craziest host of conjectures. And I read the little note 100,000 times, and I kissed it, and I examined it for some word I might have forgotten or overlooked, and my reverie grew even deeper, more confused, and I was in a strange condition, sleeping with open eyes, in a kind of paralysis, a torpid yet tormented state between sleep and waking, and it lasted for a quarter or an hour, or perhaps 4 hours. Suddenly I gave a start and back, and wasn't there a knock at the door, and I held my breath for a minute, 2 minutes of perfect silence, and then it came like a mouse nibbling at the soft but urgent knock, and I leaped to my feet, still dizzy, and flung the door open, and there outside it stood her boy, the same boy who I had once struck in the face with my fist, and his brown face was pale as ashes, and his confused glance spoke of misfortune, and I immediately felt horror. What happened? I managed to stammer, and he said, "Come quickly." And that was all, no more, but I was immediately racing down the stairs with the boy after me. A saddle, a kind of a small carriage stood waiting, and we got in. And what happened? I asked him, and he looked at me trembling and remaining silent and lips compressed, and I asked again. Still he was silent, and I could have struck him with my fist once more, but his dog-like devotion to her touched me, and I asked no more questions, and the little carriage trotted through the crowded streets so fast that people scattered cursing, and it left the European quarter near the beach, and its lower town, and went into the noisy turmoil in the Chinatown district, and at last we reached a narrow, remote alley, and at the carriage stopped outside a low-built house, and the place was dirty with a kind of hunched look about it, and a little shop window where a tallow candle stood, in one of those places where you would expect to find opium dens, or brothels of thieves, or a receiver cellar full of stolen goods. And the boy quickly knocked, and a boy whispered to the crack in the door, which stood ajar, and there were questions and more questions, and I could stand there no longer, and I leaped up, and I pushed the door open, and an old Chinese woman shrank back in a little scream, and the boy followed me, and he led me along the passage, opened another door and another door, leading to a dark room, with a foul smell of brandy, and a cloth, blood, and something in the room groaned, and I groped my way in. And once again his voice fell, and what he next uttered was more of a sob than of words. I groped my way, and there on a dirty mat, doubled over with pain, a groaning piece of human flesh, and there she lay. I couldn't see her face in the darkness, and my eyes weren't used to it yet, so I only groped around and found her hand hot, burning hot. and she had a temperature very high, and I shuddered, for I instantly knew it all, how she had fled here from me, and had let some dirty Chinese woman mutilate her, and only because she hoped for more silence in that quarter, and she had allowed some diabolical witch to murder her, rather than trust me, because, deranged as I hadn't spared her pride, and I hadn't helped her at once, because she feared me more than she feared death. I shouted for light, and the boy ran, and the appalling Chinese woman, her hands trembling, brought a smoking oil lamp, and I had to stop myself taking her by the filthy yellow throat as she put the lamp in the table, and its light fell and the yellow on the tortured body. And suddenly, all of my emotions were gone, all of my apathy, all of my anger, all of the impure feels of my accumulated passion. And I was nothing but a doctor now, and a human being who could understand, feel, and help. And I had forgotten myself, and I was fighting the horror of it with my senses and alert. And I felt the naked body I had desired in my dreams only as, how can I put it, as matter, an organism. I did not see her anymore, only life, defending itself against death, a human being bent double in dreadful agony. And her blood, her hot, holy blood streamed over my hands, but I felt no desire, no horror, and I was only a doctor, and I saw her only suffering, and I saw at once the barring a miracle, and all was lost. The woman was criminally clumsy hand had injured her, and she had half bled to death, and I had nothing to stop the bleeding in the stinking den, not even a clean water, and everything I touched was stiff with dirt. And we must go straight to the hospital, I said, but no sooner had I spoken than her tortured body reared convulsively. No, I would rather die. No one must know. No one. Home. I understood, and she was fighting now only to keep her secret, to preserve her honor, not to save her life, and I obeyed. The boy brought a litter, and we placed her in it, and so we carried her home, already like a corpse, leaned feverishly to the knife, fending off the frightening servant's inquiries. Like these, we carried her into her own room and closed the doors, and then the battle began, the long battle with death. Suddenly a hand clutched my hand, and I almost cried out with shock and pain, and his face in the dark was suddenly hideously close to mine. And I saw his white teeth gleam in the sudden outburst, and saw his glasses shine like two huge cat eyes in the pale reflection of the moonlight. And now he was not talking anymore, but screaming, shaken by howling rage. Do you know, stranger, sitting here so casually in your deck chair, traveling leisurely around the world, do you know what it is like to watch somebody dying? Have you even been at a deathbed? Have you seen the body contort, blue nails scrambling at the empty air while breath rattles in the dying throat, and every limb fights back, every finger is braced against the terror of it, and the eye stares into the horror for which there are no words? And have you ever experienced that, idle tourist that you are? You who call it a duty to help, and as a doctor often seen it as a clinical case and a fact, and I have studied it, so to speak, but I experienced it only once, there with her, and I died with her that night, in the dreadful night when I sat there ranking my brains to think of something, some way to staunch the blood that kept flowing, and soothe the fever consuming her before my eyes, in word of death as it came closer and closer, and I couldn't keep it from her bed. And can you guess what it means to be a doctor, to know how to combat every illness, to feel the duty of helping, and as you so savagely put it, and yet to sit helplessly by a dying woman, knowing what is happening but powerless? Just knowing that one terrible truth, that there is nothing you can do, although you would open every vein in your own body for her, and watching a beloved body bleed miserably to death in an agonizing pain, feeling a pulse that flutters and grows faint, ebbing away under your fingers, to be a doctor yet knowing of nothing of you can do, just sitting there stammering out some kind of prayer like an little old lady in the church, shaking your fist in the face of a merciful God whom you know doesn't exist. Can you understand? Can you understand? And that is just one thing I don't understand myself. How can a man manage not to die at such a moment, but wake from sleep the next morning, clean his teeth, put on his tie, and go on living, when he has experienced what I thought as her breath fail, as the first human being for whom I have really wrestled fighting, whom I wanted to keep alive with all the force of my being, as she slipped away from me to somewhere else, faster and faster, minute after minute, and my feverish brain could do nothing to keep that one woman alive. And then to add to my torment, there was something else too. As I sat at her bedside, and I had given her morphine to relieve her pain, and I saw her lying there with burning cheeks and hot and ashen. And as I sat there, I felt two eyes constantly fixed on me from behind, gazing at me with terrible expectation. And the boy sat there on the floor, quietly murmuring some kind of prayer, and when my eyes met his, I saw, oh, I cannot describe it. I saw something so pleading, so grateful in his dog-like gaze. And at the same time, he raised his hands to me as if urging me to save her. To me, you understand, he raised his hands to me as if to a god, to me, the helpless weakling who knew the battle was lost and that I was useless here as an ant scuttering over the floor, and how that gaze tormented me, that fanatical animal hope of what my art could do, and I could have shouted at him, kicked him, it hurt so much, and yet I felt that we were both linked by our love for her, by the secret. A waiting animal, an apathetic tangle of limbs, and he sat hunched just behind me. And the moment I asked for anything, he leaped to his bare, silent feet and handed it to me trembling, exactly as if that might help, might save her. I know that he would have cut his veins to help her, and she is that kind of woman. She has such power over people, and I didn't even have the power to save her from bleeding all that night, that appalling night, an endless night spent between life and death. Towards morning she awoke again and opened her eyes, and they were not cold and proud now, and there was a moist gleam of fever in them as they looked about the room as if they were strange, and then she looked at me, and she seemed to be thinking, trying to remember my face, and suddenly I saw she remembered because some kind of shock, rejection, a hostile, horrified expression came over her features, and I saw that she was thinking of her time back at the house, but then she thought again and looked at me more calmly, breathing heavily. And I felt that she wanted to speak, to say something, and again her hands began to flex, and she tried to sit up but was too weak. And I calmed her, leaned down on her, and she gave me a long, tormented look, and her lips moved slightly in last failing sound as she said, "Will no one ever know?" "No one." "No one," I said, with all of the strength of my conviction, "I promise you." But her eyes were still restless, and her fevered lips managed indistinctly to get it out. "Swear to me that no one would know. Swear." I raised my hand as if taking an oath, and she looked at me with an indescribable expression, and it was soft, warm, and grateful, yet truly grateful, and she tried to say something else. But it was too difficult for her, and she lay there for a long time, exhausted by the effort, with her eyes closed. And then a terrible part began, the terrible part, and she fought for another entire difficult hour. Not until morning was it all over. He was silent for a time, and I did not notice until the bell struck the armchair once, 3 times, 3 o'clock. And the moon was not shining so brightly now, but a different faint yellow glow was already trembling in the air, and the wind blew light breeze over time, and half an hour more, and it would be day, and the great sound of ours would extinguish by day. And I saw his features more distinctly now, and the shadows were not so densely dark in the corner where we sat, and he had taken off his cap, and now his head was bare, his tormented face even more terrible. But was already the gleaming lenses of his glass were turned to me again, and he pulled himself together, and his voice took on a sharp, derisive tone. And it was all over for her now, but not for me. I was alone with a body, but I was also alone in a strange house, in a city that would permit no secrets, and I had to keep hers. Think about it. Think about the circumstances. A woman from the colony of high society, a perfectly healthy woman who had been dancing at the government ball only that evening before, suddenly dead in her bed. And a strange doctor with her apparently called by her servants, and no one in the house saw when he arrived or where he came from. And she was carried in night by a litter, and then the door was closed, and in the morning she was dead. And only then were the servants called, and suddenly the house echoed with screams, and the neighbors would know at once. The whole city would know that there's only one man who can explain it all, and I, the stranger, the doctor, from a remote country station. A delightful situation, don't you agree? I knew what lay ahead of me. Fortunately, the boy was with me, and the good fellow who read every thought of mine in my eyes, and the yellow-skinned, dull-minded creature knew that there was still a battle to be fought. And I said to him only, "Your mistress did not want anyone to know what happened." And he returned my gaze with his moist, dog-like, yet determined gaze, and all he said was, "Yes, sir." But he washed the blood off the floor, tidied everything, and his very determination restored mine. Never in my life, I know, was a master of such concentrated energy, and I never shall be again. And when you have lost everything, you fight desperately for the last that is left, and the last was her legacy to me, my obligation to keep her secret. And I calmly received the servants and told all the same invented story. How the boy she had sent to the doctor happened to meet me by chance on his way. But while I talked apparently calmly, I was waiting all the while for the crucial appearance of the medical officer who will hand out the death certificate before we could put her in the coffin and her secret with me. And don't forget this was Tuesday and her husband would arrive on Saturday. And at last at 9 o'clock I heard the medical officer announce, and I was told the servant to send him in. And he was my superior in rank, and at the same time my rival, and the doctor whom she had often spoke with such contempt, who had obviously already heard about my application for a transfer, and I sensed his hostility at once, but that in itself stifled my backbone. And in front of the hall he immediately asked, "When did Fraud," naming her by surname, "did she die?" "At 6 in the morning." "And when did she send you?" 11 last night. "And did you know that I was her doctor?" "Yes, but this was an emergency, and then, well, she asked specifically for me. She wouldn't let them call any other doctor." And he stared at me, and a flush of red came into his pale, rather plump face, and I could tell that he felt bitter. But that was exactly what I needed, and all of my energies were concentrated on getting a quick decision, for I no longer could feel that my nerves couldn't hold on for much longer. And he was going to return a hostile reply, but then said more mildly, "You may think that you can dispense with my service, but it is still my official duty to confirm the death and establish the cause of death." I did not reply, but let him go into the room ahead of me, and then I stepped back and looked at the door and put the key on the table, and he raised his eyebrows in surprise. "What's the meaning of all of this?" That's the end of that one. Amok Part 6. I faced him calmly, and we don't have to establish the cause of death, and we had to think of a different one. And this lady called on me to treat her after suffering the consequences of an operation that went wrong. And it was too late for me to save her, but I promised that I would save her reputation, and that is what I am doing, and I am asking you to help me. And his eyes were wide with astonishment. "You surely aren't saying," he stammered, "and that you're asking me as a medical officer to conceal a crime?" "Yes, I am, and I must. So I am to pay you for your crime. I told you I didn't touch this lady, or I wouldn't have been talking to you, and I would put an end to myself by now, and she has paid me for her transgression, and it's what you call it, and there's no need for the world to know about it. And I do not allow this lady's reputation to be tarnished for no good reason." And my friend Tom made him even angrier. "You will not allow, so I suppose you are my superior, and at least you think you are, and just try to give me orders when you were summoned here from my country outpost, and I thought at once that there was something fishy going on. And nice practices you get up and going, and I must say that there's plenty of sample of your skill. But now I will examine her, and I will do it, and you may depend upon it, and that my account to which my name is signed will be correct, and I won't put my name on a lie." And I kept quite calm. "This time you must, and you won't leave the room until you do." And I put my hand in my pocket, and in fact I did not have my revolver with me, but he jumped in alarm. And I came to step closer, and I looked at him. Listen, let me tell you something, and that then need not resort to desperate measures, and I have reached a point where I set no store my life for anyone else. And I am anxious only to keep my promise that I made on a matter of death and will remain a secret. And listen to this too, and I give you my word of honor that if you will sign the certificate saying that this lady died of, well, accidentally, I will leave this country, city, and the EC in this too in the course of this week. And if you want, I will take my revolver and shoot myself soon as the coffin is on the ground. And I can make sure that no one you understand, can make any more inquiries that ought to satisfy you, and it must satisfy you. There must have been something menacing in my voice and something quite dangerous, because as I instinctively came closer, he retreated with an obvious horror of something once seen a man fleeing, running amok, wielding a kriss, and suddenly he changed and he cringed, so to speak, and he was bemused and his heart started to crumble and he remembered something with his last faint protest. It will be the first time in my life that I sign a false certificate, and I expect some words can be found, and who knows what will happen if but I simply, of course not, I said helpfully, it to strengthen his will, only move faster and only faster and say tingly sensation. But now you know something and only be hurting a living man and doing a terrible injury to a dead woman, and I'm sure you will not hesitate. And he nodded and he approached the table, and a few minutes later the certificate was made out, and it was published later in the newspaper and told a credible story of a heart attack. And then he rose and he looked at me. And you live this week then? My word of honor. And he looked at me again, and I realized that he wanted and appeared stern and objective. I will see about the coffin at once, he said, to hide his embarrassment, but whatever it is about me that made me so dreadful tormented, he suddenly offered me his hand and shook it heartily in good feeling. I hope you will better soon, he said, and I didn't know what he meant. Was I sick? Was I mad? And I accompanied him to the door and I unlocked it, and it was with my last strength that I closed it again behind me. And then the tingling in my temples returned, and everything swayed and went round before my eyes, and I collapsed beside her bed, and just as a man running amok falls senseless at the end of his frenzied career, and his nerves broke. And once again he paused, and I shivered slightly as his first blue shoulders carried the morning and the blues over the deck, but the torment face, and now plainly visible in the reflected light of dawn, was getting control of itself again. I don't know how long I lay there like a mad, and then somebody touched me, and I came to myself with a start, and it was the boy timidly standing before me with a look of devotion and gazing me uneasily. Somebody wants to see her. No one may come in. Yes, but... And there was an alarm in his eyes, and he wanted to say something, but dare not, and the very faithful creature was in some kind of torment. Who is it? And he looked at me trembling as if he feared a blow, and then he said the name of the man, the name of a name. And how does such a lowly creature come by such knowledge? And how is it that at moments these dull human souls know unspeakable tenderness? And he said very timidly, it is him. You know, like the husband of the dead woman. Like, he just arrived from a trip and the wife is dead. Like, what the hell happened? I stared again and understood at once, and I was immediately impatiently set eyes by an unknown man, and for strangely enough, you see, in the midst of one of my agony and my fever longing for fear and hate, I entirely forgotten him, and I had forgotten there was a man involved, the man whom this woman had loved, to whom she had passionately given and denied to me. Oh wait, is her lover. 24 hours, and I would still have hated him, and I would have been ready to tear him up, and now, well, I can tell you how much I wanted to see him, to love him because she had loved him, and I suddenly at the door there stood a very, very young, fair-haired officer, very awkward and very slender, very pale, and he looked like a child, so touchingly young, and I was utterly shaken to see how hard he was trying to be a man and maintain his composure and hide his emotion. It wasn't the husband that showed up, it was the lover of the woman. I saw once his hands were trembling, and he raised his cap, and I should have embraced him because he was exactly what I would have wished the man who had possessed her to be. Not a seducer, not a proud, no, still half a child, a pure, affectionate creature to whom she had given herself, and the young man stood before me awkwardly, and my avid glance, my passionate haste as I rushed to let him into him confused, and the small mustache on his upper lip trembled treacherously. And this young officer, this child, had to force himself not to sob aloud. Forgive me, he said at last, and I would have liked to see fraud. and I would have so much I'd like to see her again, and unconsciously, without any deliberate intention, I put my arm around the young stranger's shoulder, and he let himself in as if he was an invalid, and he looked at me in surprise with an infinite warmth and a grateful expression, and at that moment some kind of understanding existed between the two of us of what we had in common. We went over to the dead woman. There she lay, white-faced and linen, and I felt that my presence troubled him, so I stepped back to leave him alone with her, and he went closer, closer with such reluctant, hesitant steps, and I saw from the set of his shoulders a kind of turmoil raging within him, and he walked like a man walking in a mighty gale. And suddenly he fell to his knees beside the bed, just as I had done, and I came forward at once and raised him and led him to the armchair, and he was not ashamed anymore, but sobbed out aloud his grief, and I could say nothing. I just distinctly stroked his hair, childish soft hair, and he reached for my hand gently and yet answeringly, and suddenly I felt his eyes on me. "Tell me the truth, doctor," he stammered. "Did she lay hands on herself?" "No," I said. "And I mean, is someone to blame for her death?" "No," I said again, although a desire was rising in me to cry out, I am, and so are you." The pair of us, and her obstinacy, her ill-starred obstinacy, because, the officer knocked her up, and then so then, both of them are the reason she's dead. But I controlled myself. I repeated, no one is to blame. It is what's fate. "I can't believe it," he groaned. "I can't believe it. And she was at the ball only a day before yesterday, and she waved to me. How is it possible? How did it happen?" And I told a lie, and I did not betray her secret even to him, and we walked together like two brothers over the next day, as if irradiated by the emotion that bound us, and we did not confess it to each other, but we both felt that our whole lives had been dependent on that woman. And sometimes the truth rose to my lips, choking me, but I gritted my teeth, and he never learned that she had carrying his child, or that I had been asked to kill the child, his offspring, and that she had taken it down into the abyss with her. And yet we talked of nothing but her in those days, and when I was hiding away with him, for I forgot to tell you that they were looking for me, and her husband had arrived after the coffin was closed and wouldn't accept the medical findings, and there were all kinds of rumors, and he was looking for me, but I couldn't bear to see him when I knew that she had suffered in her marriage to him. I hid away for 4 days, and I didn't go out of the house, and neither of us left her lover's apartment, and he booked me a passage under a false name so I could get away easily, and I went on board by night, like a thief in case anyone recognized me. And I left everything, and I was behind my house, all my work, all the last 7 years, my possessions, and they are there for anyone who wants them. And the government gentleman will have struck me off the records for deserting my post without leave. But I couldn't live anymore in that house or in that city, in that world where everything reminded me of her. And I fled like a thief in the night just to escape her, just to forget. But as I came aboard that night, it was at midnight, my friend was with me, and then they were just hauling something by crane, something rectangular, black, her coffin. Do you hear her coffin? She has followed me here, just as I follow her, and I am to stand by and pretend to be a stranger because her husband was with it and is going back to England with him. And perhaps he plans to have an autopsy carried out there, and he has snatched her away. And she is again, and not ours, and she will no longer belong to the two of us, but I am still here, and I will go to her to the end, and he will not, and must never know, and I will defend her secret against any attempt. Against this whole ruffian whom she fled to her death, and he will learn nothing. Her secret is mine alone. So you understand, do you realize why I can't endure the company of human beings, and I can bear their laughter to hear their flirting and mating, for her coffin is stowed away down here in the hole between the Bay of Steel and Brazil nuts. And I can get at the hole that is locked, but I'm aware of it all of my senses, and I know that there's every second day, and even if they play waltzes and tangos, it is stupid the sea washes over millions of dead corpses in the rotting beneath every plot of ground on every step. Yet I cannot bear it, and I feel the dead presence, and I know that what she wants, and I know it, and I still have a duty to do. And I'm not finished yet. Her secret is still not quite safe, and she won't let me go. Slow steps slamming down amid the ships, and the sailors were beginning to dock and rising he murmured, I'll be off, and it was painful to see him in his devastating glance, his swollen eyes red with drink or tears, and he didn't want my pity. And I sensed shame in his hunched form and endless shame for giving his story away to me during the night, and on impulse I asked him, May I visit you in your cabin afternoon? And he looked at me, and there was a derisive, harsh, sardonic set to his mouth, and a touch of malevolence came out from every word, distorting it. Ah, your famous duty, the duty to help, I see. You were fortunate enough to make me talk by quoting the maxim, but no, sir. Don't think I am better now that I am torn my guts before you, showing you the feels inside of me. There is no mending my spoiled life anymore, and I have served the honorable Dutch government for nothing. And I can wave goodbye to my pension, and I come back to Europe, a poor, penniless cur. A cur whining behind a coffin. You don't run amok for long with impunity, and you're bound to be struck down in the end. And I hope that it will all be over for me soon. And no, thank you, sir, and I will turn down your kind offer, and I have my own friends in my cabin and a few good bottles of old whiskey that sometimes comfort me, and then I have my old friend of the past, though I didn't turn it against myself when I should have done, my faithful Browin, and in the end it will help me better than any talk, and please don't try it. The one human right one has left is to die as one wishes and keep it well away from a stranger's help. And what's more, he gave me a derisive, indeed challenging look, but I felt that it was really one only of shame and endless shame. And then he hunched his shoulders and turned without a word and across the deck, which was already bright with sunlight, making the cabins and holding himself in that curious way, leaning sideways, and I never saw him again, and I looked for him in our usual place that night and the next night, and he kept out of sight, and I might have thought that it was a dream of mine or a fantastic apparition had I not noticed among the passengers a man with a black mourning band in his arm, a Dutch merchant, and I was told whose wife had just died of some tropical disease. And I saw him walking down, grave and grieving, keeping away from others, and the idea I knew that his secret sorrow made me oddly timid, and I always turned aside as he passed by so as not to give away with so much of a glance that I knew more than his sad story than he did himself. Then in Naples Harbor there was a remarkable accident, and I believe that I can find its a cause of stranger story. And for most of the passengers had gone ashore that evening, and I myself went to the opera, and then no one the brightly lit cafes of Via Rome. And as one were our way back to the ship in the dingy, I noticed several boats circling the vessel with torches and ascending lamps as in search of something. And up in the dark deck there was much mysterious coming and going of the carabinieri of all the policemen. And I asked Aselio what had happened, and he avoided giving me a direct answer in a way that immediately told me that the crew had orders to keep quiet, and the next day too. And when I was come on board again, we sailed to Genoa without a hint of any further incident, and there was nothing to be learned on board. Not until I saw in the Italian newspaper that I read the accounts written in flowery terms of an alleged accident in the Naples harbors. On the night in question, they rode at a very quiet in order to avoid upsetting the passengers. A coffin of a distinguished lady from the Dutch colonies was to be moved from ship to a boat, and it had just been let down the rope side of the ropes in their ladders in her husband's presence when something heavy fell from the deck above, carrying the coffin away into the sea, along with the man handling it and the woman's husband who was helping them hoist it down. And on the newspaper said that a madman had flung himself down the steps onto the rope ladder, and another stated that the ladder had broken itself under the too much weight. And in any case, the shipping company had done all it could to cover up what exactly happened, and the handles of the coffin and the dead woman's husband had been pulled out of the waters into the boats, and not without much difficulty. But the lead coffin itself sank straight to the bottom and could not be retrieved, and the brief mentioned in another report of the fact that at the same time the body of a man about 40 had been washed ashore in the harbor did not seem to be connected to the public mind with a romantic account of the accident. But as soon as I had read those lines, I thought as if the wide moonlight face with the gleaming glasses was staring back at me again in a ghostly fashion from behind the sheet of the newsprint. Alright, we're done with Amok. Bye-bye and God bless.